Since when did the 7 deadly sins become a game? Why are they such a joke? Today's guest says if we stop playing a game around our vices and take a serious look at them, our lives could actually be filled with the things we all long for: love, integrity, and freedom. Find out how today on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Rebecca DeYoung of the Calvin College Philosophy Department and author of Glittering Vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me.
So I was really interested in the book, and I thought, vices, that could be challenging, but I had no idea that I was going to find all of the vices in my own self.
I had the same reaction writing the book, actually.
This human nature concept of how we are all made started so early. People were looking at this so early, in the 300s?
Yeah, it really started in a desert community in Egypt in about 200 AD. People, Christians in particular, trying to live out their calling to be fully Christ-like. So this process of soul formation and the imitation of Christ was really at the core of their program. And it's true. I think looking inward to try to understand ourselves is an impulse we all have.
Right.
From philosophers to people who read those little quizzes in magazines,
right.
Which score do you have on the multiple choice test? We all sort of want to understand ourselves better, and the monks in Egypt were looking inward to try to understand what's gone wrong and how to be reformed in the image of Christ, and that was really their project.
And their lists varied some over the centuries.
Yeah, I mean, it really came out of a kind of pastoral setting. I mean, you think about some of the earliest writers in this tradition were really doing something very much closer to spiritual direction, or even counseling of the way we do it today.
With other parishioners?
Yeah,
or with the community?
With the community of monks that was out in the desert on this spiritual program. And so when you read their writings, it doesn't read sort of like a systematic treatise. It reads like, I've been doing counseling for 30 years. And when people come in presenting this symptom or this problem, it's usually this.
Oh.
And so it's very, there's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of sort of witty aphorisms, little proverbs, stories about a disciple coming to a master and saying, Abba, give me a word. And the Abba gives him sort of a life lesson to go out and practice.
Okay.
What Gregory the Great did is he took a list of 8, sometimes 9 of these vices, and he pulled pride off and stuck it at the root. So if you think of the vices as a big tree, pride is the root, and it kind of feeds the whole system. And then the main branches are the 7 capital vices, and then they all sort of bear fruit with further vices from there. So the idea is you can't just pick off a few leaves and twigs and branches. You got to dig down to the main feeder branches and then get down and grind the stump, get to the root of the problem.
This was a practical
Very
use.
much. Practical, pastoral. It's really about the reformation of the heart. And they took very seriously the fact that we're embodied beings, so the practices were all about eating and sleeping and working and reading, and they were all very sort of practical things to do, which I think helps people today too. Sometimes we talk about practices, devotional practices like prayer and Bible study, which are absolutely essential. But then what if you transferred that idea of practical disciplines into every area of your life? What you ate for breakfast and where you shop. It's sort of that kind of extension to everything that they're trying to effect.
And this is all to be a better person. I think the phrase you use is that you can have harmony and integrity in your life, that this would be a goal.
Right.
And it would be a better life if you had that kind of makeup and that kind of harmony and integrity.
Yeah, the idea is that God wants you to flourish, right? Jesus came to give us life in abundance. He doesn't want us to live in a way that shortchanges our capacities. He wants us to sort of fully live into the life He's called us to live. And so there's a certain amount of discipline and suffering and painful dying of the old self that happens in that process, but the goal is complete beautiful relationship with God.
Right.
One of the examples I like to use with my students is an old movie from the 80s called Groundhog Day, where Phil Connors is played by Bill Murray, and he lives this selfish life, and it leads him to isolation because he can't have a genuine love relationship with anybody when he only wants what he wants, and he's using everybody else just to get what he wants. And so he ends up in despair, and there's a number of suicide scenes in the film. Of course, he's unable to commit suicide because he has to keep reliving Groundhog Day over and over again. But the idea is then a switch turns on at some point in the movie, and he says, you know what, I'm going to try this virtue program and see, because I've tried everything else. I've tried all the selfish possibilities out there.
And so I'm still not happy.
No, he's miserable. So he tries the virtue program, and lo and behold, he becomes better. He becomes happier, and he suddenly has friendships with people in town, and also he gets the love relationship that he wants.
Right.
Now, you could read St. Augustine's Confessions exactly the same way. It's sort of like a Groundhog Day type story where Augustine tries everything wrong. He says, I looked for love in all the wrong places, roughly, and it left me miserable. So only when I sort of turned to God and tried to find love in Him did I find myself in a place of true rest. So,
and you talk about the habits forming. In Groundhog Day is a sense that he gets to try habits over and over again.
He has to. He has no other choice.
Right. But this idea that good habits actually lead to good innate choices, and sort of habits that are like some of the vices, all about me, or lazy, or greedy, or envious, they actually make us respond to things when we quickly respond in a way that doesn't help us out.
Right. I think what they do is, you start with activities and practices, but they form your desires. They form your outlook. So when you see a situation, if you're formed by a vice, certain features will pop out at you, and you'll have the moral landscape kind of painted a certain way.
Like a cloud picture now, like a word picture, like what are the big words?
Yeah. And then if in the training toward virtue, you'll end up sort of in this confused state or a conflicted state when you're on the way toward training from vice to virtue. But once you're in a virtuous state, then the vicious point of view often doesn't even occur to you. It's just not even on the radar screen. And the idea is then that the right things sort of pop out of the landscape, and you focus on those.
So how did you get drawn into this fascinating topic that has both hard and difficult
well, I think
areas?
my own struggles led me in. You know how it is when you're struggling with something, you want someone to explain your situation, to sort of, and not only to name the problem in a satisfying way where you can say, oh, that's what I was struggling with. Now I understand it. That also helps you move out of it. It's a kind of a liberating moment, actually, to see how many things are wrong with you, because then you can find a way forward. You know what to work on. And the nice thing about this tradition is it will also tell you how to work on those things. So it's not just leaving you with a horrible diagnosis. They also have a treatment program, which is always happy to have at the end of the day. So my own struggles in grad school and reading Thomas Aquinas led me to a point where I found a vice that named my struggle, and the tradition also named a way forward. So the name of the vice was pusillanimity, which I know just rolls off the tongue.
Say that again.
Pusillanimity. What it really means is sort of a faint-heartedness. It's a lack of confidence in your ability to carry out the calling that God has given you, in part because you've lost sight of the fact that it's God's call, and therefore you'll get His power to carry it out. So I was on this grad school, very difficult grad school program, trying to do it all by myself, on my own power, working like crazy, and finding myself hopelessly inadequate and hoping no one else would notice. And I call it Impostor Syndrome in the book, and I think it's something everybody goes through in that
has
situation.
When you walk into a room, you think, they don't know that I'm an imposter.
That's right.
Haven't we all had that?
And if I can fake my way long enough, maybe they won't throw me out in shame and horror. So I went through this phase, and I was reading Aquinas on pusillanimity, and I thought, oh, that's me. It's Moses at the burning bush. It's me in grad school. This names my problem. And then it also sort of gave me a way out of it. It turns out that pusillanimity is one of the offspring vices of sloth. Sloth is one of the capital vices, which is rooted in pride. So there I was, attached to the tree. Now it was time to sort of do a roadmap of the whole landscape.
Let's just talk a little bit about sloth, because a lot of people talk about sloth, and we have a general sense that that just means we're lazy.
Sure.
Yeah, but there's more to it.
It's really not laziness so much as it is about laziness about love.
Laziness about love. Yeah. See, that just, no one wants to be lazy about love. We all want to think that we're good at at love, about
Right.
extending.
Well,
So-
I think more accurately, we all want love.
Yes.
We just don't want it to be too much work. As in,
We don't want it to cost us something. We just want to get it.
Yeah, exactly. So spiritually speaking, we want the comfort of God's presence and salvation, but we really don't want all that sort of horrible dying off to the old self stuff that involves sacrifice and commitment and discipline. And I think the same thing is true in human relationships, right? We want them to be easy. We want it to be like romantic love. You just fall in and it feels natural. And then, if you go on in a human friendship or in a marriage or something like that, and it lasts for decades, well, you're going to hit some rough patches and things are going to get boring sometimes, and you're going to have to sacrifice and adjust your plans and all that kind of daily selflessness. That could be a grind.
Yes.
And Sloth is about that grind, staying true to that love project over the course of a lifetime. And Sloth is getting sick of it.
Yeah, and you talk about the fact that sloth could look like in a marriage, for instance, or in a friendship. You've had a bad fight.
Yeah.
And you're just too tired and really too lazy to address it.
Right. And it might not be that you're physically so lazy, because you might go off and do lots of really busy, distracting things to avoid having
Taking
to do
care
the
of that.
forgiveness project. That's right. So lazy, it's interesting with sloths. It can look sluggish, and it can look resigned and apathetic, but it can also look highly distracted and, diversions everywhere. And I have a slide when I do a PowerPoint that has a picture of 14 people on their cell phones, all kind of clicking away. And we can do things to just fill time. You can fill time with entertainment. You can fill it with Christian ministry, all to avoid real relational work with God or with others.
So it's not that there are bad things that you're being distracted with.
No, not necessarily.
But the point is that you're lazy about the discipline of doing what is maybe a more important thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the thing about all the capital vices is that what they are, and the reason they're capital, is because they're displacement programs.
Oh.
God has this plan for my life, and my job is to wholeheartedly love him. And what I do with the capital vices is I take my love for God and set it over there, and I put some other love in that place. Something else that can give me happiness, or that I think will be a better way toward flourishing than what God has in mind for me. So pride is the root, because in every case we're saying to God, no, I don't want your program of flourishing. I want my program of flourishing.
I know better.
I have this plan. I know, and I'm going to run the show, and I'm going to engineer how it all will work, and you can just stay out of it and give me heaven at the end of the day, okay? So the pride program is really do-it-yourself, a mode of happiness. And so there's lots of things that we think will make us happy. Pleasure, money and possessions, control, power.
Right.
So the vices really arose as naming those problems, not necessarily the worst possible sins you could have, but rather happiness imitators that we all sort of naturally gravitate to in our sinful state.
Well, there's been a lot of movies about greed, and
Sure.
greed is one of those capital vices.
Absolutely.
We've got the Gordon Geckos and materialism and so on. You talk about the fact that greed is often using people to get something that you might want.
One of I think the more interesting offspring vices of greed is callousness, just a kind of insensibility to mercy. Oh. So what greed does is it makes my possessions and my ownership of them sort of the central program. So having things and my own sense of being a controlling master of all that I possess is the dominant paradigm from which your life is lived. Well, where do people fit in that program? Well, they just become one more thing to be owned, used, mastered, under my control.
So is control sort of an offshoot of greed?
It's certainly related, yeah.
Wow.
No, the idea that I want to make myself self-sufficient so I don't have to rely on anybody else, most of all God, but certainly not other people either. So you're unable to receive gifts well, to take things from others that can't be returned. The idea is, you sort of in a Scrooge-like way, you just can't see other people's suffering because you're so focused on myself and the way people either fit or don't fit into my program of accumulating more wealth and control and power for myself. And the trouble with all the vices is that they come with their own wonderful rationalizations, right? I'm providing for the future. I'm building a great 401k plan.
Right.
So
I've got to take care of my family.
That's absolutely right. And so there's lots of ways that we can cover up these things for ourselves. And that's one of the fun effects of engaging in the spiritual disciplines. I often don't have any idea that I even have a problem with a given area. I mean, sometimes you have presenting symptoms. You're like, I have a problem, I can't name it. But other cases, you think, well, I'm fine about this, right? I'm really doing just fine. And then you engage in a spiritual discipline, and it unearths all the layers of twistedness deep down in the depths of your soul. And it also offers a way of working those out and working those into, I think, what I'd call a positive or preventative program. Fasting often works like this. It clears away some things. It rearranges your life and your priorities. Oh, and then you can see things you didn't see before. When you're in a position of need, for example, physical hunger yourself, you're just that much more attuned to other people's needs. Suddenly you have an automatic sympathy with being in a position of need. Well, guess what that opens up? And so I think those spiritual disciplines are a positive program in that way also.
I think a number of people could resonate with the fact that they don't want to say no to somebody or to a project, because really what's underneath is that they want to be affirmed and thought well of. And,
yes.
And so this is a disorder that happens so common.
Right. And it's one of my favorite vices, actually. It's vainglory. And it's one that most people haven't heard of.
Vainglory is not a set of words that we use.
It's not a common
right?
English term anymore. Right. Vanity's not quite the same. Conceit, not quite the same. Vainglory is really all about image and wanting to present the right sort of image so that other people will love us and accept us. And so it's the big fake it vice. And it's one I think that we really struggle with because we live in such an image-based culture. So one of my projects is to kind of bring that word back into our current vocabulary so we have a way of naming the problem. Otherwise, what else is it but good marketing?
Right, but it's a loving unconditionally. I think all
yes.
of us long to be loved unconditionally. You write in the book and you say, but if you never show
right.
The ugliness, how would you ever expect anybody to love you unconditionally, because they are just loving this perfect kind of presentation, this perfect image. So it actually is an obstacle to the very thing we desire most, which is unconditional love.
Right. There's a kind of paradox, and it's true of all the vices, but in particular that one. By putting up that mask, that beautiful mask, what you're really doing is working for a love and acceptance you can only get by dropping the mask. Because you want to be loved for your true self, and yet you're unwilling to show it. And I think that's one of the interesting things about vainglory, is that it can be motivated by fear of lack of acceptance, as well as by sort of wanting to look better than you are, just to show off. So there's kind of an arrogant form, and there's sort of a fearful form. By the time you get those two forms on the table, you've got about everybody covered. So if there's anybody I haven't made feel guilty yet, now you're all in the pot with me.
I received an email while I was reading your book, and the person said, I didn't get back to you before because I'm in a cafe in Paris. And I thought, I
want your life.
So envy popped up just like that.
Right, sure. Yeah, and envy is a fun vice because a lot of people think of it as involving a particular item that a person has. I'm envious of your car, and that's certainly a way that we talk. There's nothing wrong with that. But envy really, I think, has to do with the personal qualities. And that's why it's such a vicious thing. It's one thing if I could just take your car away and be happy with it. That's bad enough, right? That's covetousness, strictly speaking. But with envy, what I really want is to take you down. I don't want just my own happiness through having whatever it is. I want to engineer your unhappiness. So envy is trying to level the status or even take you down a little bit below mine. And because it's personal like that, it's really an enemy of love. It can't rejoice in other people's good fortune and blessings, and it really takes delight when things go badly for other people.
It does. And you're not the kind of person that people want to be around, and then it brings the isolation. And you talk about how these vices bring isolation.
Right. Especially with something like envy, you're always in a comparative frame of mind. So as with pride, it's a status comparison. Am I, better than you? Am I more loved than you? Am I everything? And it's always a comparative, conditional thing. So if I have this quality, then people will love me more than they love you. And because I'm above you, then I'll be happy. So if your happiness always depends on being positively compared to others, well, that's pretty fragile. Because there are a lot of other people in the world, and lots of others of them have things better than you. And so you're really sort of dooming yourself to a lifetime of
misery.
Yes,
really,
absolutely.
It's a lifetime misery.
I think envy is one of the more miserable ones. And again, what you have to do is really just kind of switch mental paradigms. You have to get out of the comparative game altogether. And this is where I think the Christian tradition is especially helpful. I read secular accounts of how to cure envy, and they just really don't have an answer. They're like, well, try to be constructive about your competitions, and maybe envy will help you get ahead and work harder at being a better person. Well, baloney to that. I think what we really need is God saying to us, before you were born, I loved you just the way you are. You know that unconditional love you're trying to get through, you've already got it. You can now live fully from that platform. You can have faults, you can have weaknesses, you can grow, you can become lots of things without shame because you're already loved. So stop trying to manufacture that for yourself through an envy competition.
And so this idea about gluttony, for instance, this vice of gluttony,
right.
That you helped to explain that. It was more than just the love of food.
Sure. It's actually the love of the pleasure of eating. And so it really, in the end, doesn't matter what the food is or how much you eat. It's about how much pleasure you take in the act of eating. So in the Screw Tape Letters...
Is it bad to have pleasure, though?
No, pleasure's... Well, that's the thing about all the vices. They're all good things. But they are created things that we're putting in the place of the Creator. So it's that idolatrous switch that's the problem. It's not a problem with the goodness of the creation. There's nothing wrong with pleasure and beauty and love and...
Great food and feasting.
Absolutely.
Right.
In the tradition, you don't find a whole lot of talk about moderation. You find fasting and feasting talk. So there's nothing wrong with feasting, that's for sure. Church potlucks would be doomed without that concept. But the idea is that you use the pleasure of food to fill an emptiness in yourself, which you should really be filling with something else.
Right. And the same way with anger, there's quite a bit of discussion about whether anger is in fact a vice.
Yes, that's true. And there's actually disputes in the tradition itself. The early Desert Fathers said, no anger. If you're angry at anything, maybe at your own sin.
Oh.
But other than that, never angry with a brother or sister in Christ. Never, ever, ever. And that's a pretty strong line to take. Of course, what I did with my students then is we documented our occasions of anger, times we were angry during the week. And we did it for 1 week, and we said what we were angry about and how angry we were on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we just put it away for a while. And then when we came back to the list, what we discovered is that we were angry almost always about the wrong things, and we were too angry about them. So in practical terms, putting away all anger would have been a really healthy program for me because almost all my anger was bad.
But yes, right. But what about injustice?
Yeah,
like an
exactly.
Anger like that?
So Thomas Aquinas kind of comes back and says, wait a minute, folks. There's healthy anger. It's a natural God-given emotion. It's our response to genuine injustice. And another good test is to see what you get angry about is about injustice done to other people or injustice done to yourself. All these imagined slights to our great honor. And again, we usually err on the side of getting really livid about injustices toward ourselves. But it's true that anger is, in a healthy way, directed at threats and can be a wonderful aid. So all the passions and emotions that we have, when they're directed at good things and for good purposes, can be healthy aids to the way we function in the world. And Aquinas is really happy to say your body and your emotions should be trained to be on the same program that your heart for God is. And when you have all of you moving in the same direction, you'll be a more healthy and whole person than if you have your mind sort of signed onto the program and your emotions fighting against you.
Let's talk about the last deadly sin, which is lust. In today's society, certainly pornography is almost being presented as mainstream. It's just a personal choice. But this idea of lust strips love from sex.
That's right. And part of the issue with pornography is if you think of it just as a personal choice, this tradition encourages you to think about what that choice will do when it's practiced over the course of a lifetime. And the tradition says it will make you incapable of true love, true friendship, true care for another human being as a human being.
It's a huge cost. Exactly.
And it really launches you into the realm of fantasy and away from what it takes to love a real human being. And so one of the things that is a remedy for lust is finding good, healthy friendships to fill our life with. It's not just sort of taking out bad desires, but it's cultivating the right sorts of relationships in all of their glory and in all their difficulty, and learning to love real people.
Can we do this in an individual way? Do we have to be in community? Because it feels to me like this is a big project, And
it's
it would
very
be
daunting.
Yeah, it would be helpful if people were coming alongside in a grace-filled way to either point it out or to encourage or to listen.
My own sense is that you can't do this alone, and that's affirmed by the tradition. If you think about the way that these practices evolved, it was in a community of like-minded people on the same project, and these monks would go out into the desert on their own for the week to pray and to hold vigils. But they would come back on the weekends for communion and shared worship and spiritual direction. So there was always a touchstone, and you knew that everyone else in the community was on the same program that you were. And likewise, with Gregory the Great and Aquinas, sort of medieval thinkers, they're living in monastic communities. And I think they don't talk about the need for community because it's in the air they breathe. Now, for us, we're living a kind of individualistic, more Protestant spirituality, where we do tend to be more, I'll do my personal devotions. And for some people, even Sunday worship is optional. They can love God very well on their own. And I think this program of formation just doesn't work very well. I think we're social beings, and everybody knows that when you're trying to change habits, you need structure, you need institutions that help shape you in certain directions and give you resistance to other directions, and we need the encouragement of others.
We do.
So that's a big deal. I do think we need to figure out how to do this communally, corporately, and even institutionally.
My guest today has been Rebecca DeYoung of the Calvin College Philosophy Department and the author of Glittering Vices, a new look at the 7 deadly sins and their remedies. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.